Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're looking at some really fascinating research. It gets right to a core question, I think, for anyone involved in property or community planning. How much does the success of, say, the local coffee shop or the small tech firm down the street really impact your property's value?
hmm And it's not just a loose connection, is it? The sources we've gathered really underline this strong interdependence. For property owners, investors, even city planners, understanding this is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, we're going beyond just saying a good economy helps.
hmm
Our mission today is to really unpack the mechanics. How does a thriving local business scene translate, sometimes very directly, into higher real estate values?
Exactly. The core idea is pretty clear from the research. Successful local businesses, especially SMEs, small to medium enterprises, tend to boost property values, both residential and commercial. But the flip side is just as stark. When local business activity dips, property values often take the first hit.
So let's get specific. How does that dollar earned by a local bakery, for instance, actually ripple out to affect home prices? We want to nail down how these SMEs and also these huge shifts we're seeing in work patterns, like remote work, how they're acting as the real engines for the property markets now.
Right. And maybe the best place to start is with the traditional model, how things worked for decades, which was all about local businesses providing local jobs. That was the engine.
Okay, so that traditional engine. Local businesses signal a thriving community. That's the idea.
hmm
But what's the actual mechanism? How does that signal turn into, well, higher property values?
hmm
Because the research says it attracts capital, not just people.
Yeah, that's key. It often comes down to liquidity and the velocity of money locally. When small businesses are doing well, they generate wealth within the community. People have more disposable income, wages might be higher, savings stronger.
Right. Money circulating locally.
Yeah, exactly. And that translates into more people having funds for down payments, easier mortgage approvals, more money for renovations, even new construction. It's this flow, this velocity of local capital that provides a structural lift to real estate values across that area.
That makes a lot of sense. It's not just jobs. It's creating buyers with cash, underwriting the local market,
Mhm.
essentially. But you mentioned the flip side. The sources are clear. It's a two-way street. What happens when that engine sputters? How bad can it get?
Well, it can be pretty brutal and sometimes asymmetrical. If a huge factory closes, the impact is immediate, devastating. Property values can plummet almost overnight because the main job source just vanished.
Right. That's the dramatic scenario.
But the slow creep of failure can be just as damaging, even if it's less visible day to day. Think about dozens of small shops, maybe restaurants or service businesses, closing over time because costs are too high or demand is low. That slow erosion, it hits the town's tax base, makes the community feel less desirable, leads to underinvestment. Property values deflate, just maybe over a few years instead of overnight.
And underneath all of this, whether it's one big employer or lots of small ones, it's really about employment, isn't it? Job stability seems to be the absolute bedrock. If people feel secure in their jobs, they feel secure enough to buy a house.
Precisely. That's the foundation of consumer confidence, especially for big commitments like mortgages. And job growth kicks off a positive feedback loop. New jobs attract new residents, which spikes housing demand, which pushes up prices.
Yeah.
And it's also about the type of jobs sometimes. Industries with stable, well-paying jobs, think advanced manufacturing, maybe a strong tech sector. They don't just lift values. They make the whole market more resilient, less prone to shocks from the wider economy.
But we have seen that resilience fails spectacularly. The research points to the 2008 crash as a really stark example of this connection. It wasn't just about bad loans, was it? It was deeply tied to the job market collapse.
Absolutely. The unemployment spike back then was huge. It created widespread fear about job security. And when people lose faith in their future employment, they just stop. They stop spending, they stop moving house, and critically, they stop borrowing.
Right.
The job market's fall basically stripped away the confidence needed for real estate investment. That drove down demand, led to foreclosures. It became this vicious cycle. Stability, or the perception of it, really governs the whole system's health.
Okay, so that paints the picture of the, let's call it the old world, where value was tied tightly to stable jobs nearby. But now, things are getting really interesting with the remote work revolution. This feels like a major disruption. If job security isn't tied to being near the office anymore, what does that do to property values?
It's transforming everything. I mean, really transforming how property markets function. Remote work fundamentally weakens that link between employment and a specific geographic location. So that traditional pull of the big city center, as the only place for certain high-paying jobs, that's fading. And it's giving people, families especially, way more flexibility about where they choose to live. Quality of life, space, affordability, those are moving up the priority list. Commute time, less so.
So this sounds like rocket fuel for suburbs, maybe even rural areas. We hear anecdotes, but what's the data showing? Is it really shifting demand and prices significantly? Are cities dying?
While dying is probably too strong, but the dynamics are definitely changing. We are seeing clear migration patterns away from the most expensive, dense urban cores. Think downtown Manhattan, central San Francisco, toward maybe secondary cities, or definitely the exurbs.
Those Zoom towns people talk about.
Exactly. And yes, that migration is boosting demand and prices in areas that were, frankly, less popular before.
And it's not just where people live, it's what they want in a home too, right?
Yeah, precisely. The home itself has become this hybrid space: office, school, gym, and living space. So we're seeing much higher demand for larger homes, places with dedicated office space, reliable high-speed internet, maybe more outdoor space. And that demand for more square footage, combined with rising prices in these newly popular areas, tends to push up the average home price overall.
Okay, but is this sustainable? Is the suburban boom just a temporary bubble? I mean, won't companies eventually pull people back to the office, at least part-time? Won't the appeal of city amenities eventually win out, causing these exorbitant prices to maybe...
Correct. That's the million-dollar question for investors right now, isn't it? The research acknowledges that, yes, fully remote forever might not be standard for everyone. Hybrid models seem likely to stick, though.
Right, maybe 2 or 3 days in the office.
Yeah. But even a 2-day commute is less attractive than 0 days, especially if the cost of living difference is significant. But perhaps the bigger, more immediate story is on the commercial side. That's where the impact is really hitting hard in city centers. Less need for massive, centralized office footprints.
Right, we're seeing reports of rising vacancy rates, falling commercial property prices in major downtowns. Is that hitting all types of commercial buildings equally, or are some suffering more than others?
There's definitely a difference. The top tier Class A office buildings, modern, great location, good amenities, they're holding up reasonably well, especially if they adapt to hybrid work needs like more meeting spaces, fewer dedicated desks.
Okay.
The real pain is in the older stock, Class B, Class C buildings. They're often harder and more expensive to retrofit for today's needs. They're seeing the biggest price drops because, for many companies adopting hybrid models, these older buildings feel kind of obsolete.
So, connecting the dots here, this commercial downturn is obviously a huge headache for city budgets and existing owners. But it also sounds like a massive opportunity for developers, right? This idea of adaptive reuse.
Absolutely. That's potentially the next big wave in real estate development. These underused or vacant office buildings,
Yeah.
they don't have to just sit empty. They represent potential.
For what exactly?
Well, conversion to residential units is the obvious one, especially given housing shortages in many cities. But also potentially community spaces, maybe schools, urban farms, or even smaller distributed co-working hubs that serve people living nearby, maybe in those converted apartments.
Interesting.
It could actually revitalize some of these office-heavy districts, turning them into more vibrant, genuinely mixed-use neighborhoods. It requires investment and probably some zoning flexibility, but the potential is there.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up for our listener. What are the key takeaways if you're trying to navigate this shifting landscape? First, it seems clear. Local businesses aren't just background noise. They actively pump capital into the local housing market. That connection is direct.
Right. And second, the whole dynamic of employment and location has been scrambled. Value is shifting geographically because of remote work, but it's still fundamentally tethered to job security wherever that job might be based.
So the crucial lesson here for you as an investor or maybe a seller is you can't just rely on the old location, location, location mantra anymore. Not entirely.
Exactly. You have to actively consider the health of local businesses, even small ones, and the underlying employment trends. Market resilience looks different now. It might be defined less by proximity to downtown and more by, say, the quality of broadband internet access in an area.
So really understanding these evolving dynamics is key for anyone making strategic decisions. Property owners, investors, community planners. Getting it right contributes not just to your own success, but to the overall health of local economies and property markets.
The sources really drive home that the market is now less about a fixed spot on a map and much more about the economic vitality and the job security that underpins it, wherever that vitality happens to be growing.
Which brings us to a final thought for you to chew on, something building on that adaptive reuse idea we touched on. If the demand for those big traditional urban office blocks really does keep shrinking, how fast can city governments and zoning boards actually adapt?
Yeah. How quickly can they change the rules to make it easier, maybe even incentivize, converting those obsolete Class B office towers into apartments, which are desperately needed in many places?
That speed of policy change. That might just be the next major factor determining real estate winners and losers in our biggest cities. Something to watch.